For today's video, we'll be kicking off my traditional Pearl Harbor week. If you've been around long enough, you'll know I dedicate the first week of December to topics relating to Pearl Harbor. Though I'll admit this December will be a touch different, being as we have December 7th on a Sunday. That aside, this video will, as such, be a Pearl Harbor related topic. Specifically a look at a handful of myths that still linger about this attack, from the mythical third wave to the sleeping giant quote. It'll be on the shorter end, admittedly, focused on a brief telling, third wave aside, of each myth and why they're a myth. Mostly because every other video this week will be substantially longer. You'll see what I mean going into the week. So, let's start this video with the big one. The third wave, or alternatively third strike. This is a compelling myth. The Japanese could have done so much better had they sent a third wave. Alternatively, if they had just targeted the fuel and the repair facilities, Japan might have won the war. A great missed opportunity that allowed the United States Navy its chance to recover. Alternate history writers love it for this reason, as you could expect. It's also, near as I can tell, completely and utterly fictional. Primary records don't support the argument at all. The only real source is one particular Japanese officer, Mitsuo Fushida, who has become known in recent years for creative interpretations of the war. Still, to give this due diligence, what would such a third wave have entailed? As is fairly well known, even outside historical circles, the Japanese had 6 aircraft carriers. Between them, those 6 ships would have held somewhere in the range of 400 combat-capable aircraft. For a detailed breakdown, Akagi held 27 B-5N Kates, 18 D-3A Vals, and 21 Zeros. Kaga had 27 Kates, 27 Vals, and 21 Zeros. Soryu carried 18 Kates, 18 Vals, and 21 Zeros. You're probably seeing a pattern appearing. Anyway, Hiryu carried the same loadout as her half-sister. 18 Kates and Vals each, plus the 21 Zeros. Shokaku, meanwhile, was different. She had 27 Kates, 27 Vals, and 18 Zeros. The same went for Zuikaku. That means 144 Kates split between torpedo and level bombers, with 135 Val dive bombers and 120 Zeros. 399 aircraft in all. That is, of course, counting spares. In fairness, I've seen 414 aircraft cited as well. Now, over the course of the first 2 waves, the Japanese lost 29 planes. That doesn't seem like very much. But you need to take into account they had another 70 or so damaged to varying degrees. Those may or may not have been repairable by the time a third wave could be launched. Delaying any third wave for the sake of repairing those planes or breaking out spares, well, that would take time. Time that the American defenders could use to scramble aircraft and prepare their defenses even more. The Japanese had already doubled their losses between the 2 waves. 9 aircraft in the first and 20 in the second. A third wave would have no element of surprise on top of having fewer aircraft. Imagine the Japanese losing another 20 to 40 planes plus more damaged. That could have happened. And as such, they could hypothetically lose half the Kido-Butai strike force in the Pearl Harbor operation. There's also the issue of spotting a strike in the first place. Even proponents of the third wave agree that the Japanese would have to land both the first and second, and then prepare the third. One need only look at Midway to see the issue. In quoting Shattered Sword, as we have seen, spotting a strike for launch was a complex process that typically took a minimum of around 45 minutes and often occupied upward of an hour. This was at Midway after the Japanese crews had gained more combat experience. At Pearl Harbor, the relatively green crews would have to figure out which aircraft were capable of launch, which pilots were still up to flying after hours in the air, and then loading up for an attack, while the ones up top likely argued between hitting ships or shore targets. I would honestly be amazed if a third strike would have been in the air in anything less than an hour. As it was, it took about 2 hours for each wave to fly from the carriers to the harbor. The first wave left at 6:18 a.m. and arrived at 7:55. The second wave left the harbor around 9:45 to 10 a.m. If we presume a 2-hour round trip, they'd return around noon. That doesn't seem rough, but you'd have to land the aircraft, which were over 100. Then you'd have to refuel, rearm, and inspect for damage, all of which would take time. An hour might honestly be generous. All of this means that the third wave would likely take off well into the afternoon and return at night. That was not something the Japanese were trained for, and they would likely have lost planes in the attempt. As well as this, the fuel situation on the Japanese fleet was not great. It's generally estimated that if the Japanese had stayed much longer, they would have been risking having to leave destroyers behind, because they were that low on fuel. The attack on Pearl Harbor was stretching Japanese fuel logistics to their absolute breaking point. That thought was almost certainly running through Nagumo's head, as well as the fact the American carriers were somewhere else, and the Japanese had no idea where. Enterprise was nearby, but historically would not arrive until the night of December 8th. You can see why this was never seriously contemplated, and even if it was, it probably wouldn't have involved attacking shore targets. Japanese doctrine called for hitting ships first, land targets second, as partial notes in an article on Fushida's claims, which is basically the only quote-unquote source on a third wave. Fushida made an argument that he, argued for the third strike, strenuously in fact, and was promptly denied. That has been parroted ever since, from Tora 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 to documentaries. However, others present that day, such as Minoru Genda, deny this. So, really, there was likely never going to be a third wave. It's why I chose this to be the first myth of Pearl Harbor. I can't say with absolute certainty that no one aboard those ships thought maybe we could attack again after the wild success of the first two waves. But, for better or worse, we only have one questionable source on a serious argument, and counters to that source from others present that day. It's very, very unlikely. Still, though, I suppose it's not completely made up like the next one. That being the famous sleeping giant quote, where Admiral Yamamoto said, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." To be more accurate, the actor portraying Yamamoto in Tora 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 said that line. A suitably solemn portrayal for a solemn and far-seeing quote. A quote that never existed so far as anyone can actually find. The producer of the film, Elmo Williams, claimed to have found the line in Yamamoto's diary. No one has found it since. A similar claim that the screenwriter found it in a 1943 letter has also never been verified. And that one is particularly interesting, being as Yamamoto died in April of 1943. Not much time to write that supposed letter. So, the quote makes for good cinema and has been copied in both Pearl Harbor and the 2019 Midway. But there's absolutely no evidence it was actually spoken by the man himself. If anything, it runs counter to Yamamoto's actual view on the attack. While it's true enough that Yamamoto wasn't a fan of war with the United States and understood the nation better than most, well, here we come to the third myth, that Yamamoto was forced into the attack on Pearl Harbor, leading directly to the pessimistic quote above. This is patently untrue. While Yamamoto might have viewed himself pushed into a war that he didn't want, Pearl Harbor was his brainchild. It was Yamamoto who pushed for the attack on the Pacific Fleet, against the wishes of Japan's general staff. There was a certain reluctance in going straight for the Pacific Fleet over holding forces back for the southern thrust. Yamamoto threatened to resign if his planned attack wouldn't go through. Well, he threatened this on October 17th or 18th, 1941, through his representative at a general staff meeting. Nonetheless, the point remains. Yamamoto, far from being reluctant, pushed harder for Pearl Harbor than just about anyone. Certainly, he could have had buyer's remorse in the aftermath. Nonetheless, the idea that he said the sleeping giant quote is, admittedly, good fiction. In any event, that brings us to the final one for today. The idea that one of Japan's Midget submarines made it into the harbor and attacked Battleship Row. This was popularized a lot in the early 2000s, based on a single picture, and then later on the discovery of the wreck of the submarine. The idea that the Japanese managed to sink a sub into the harbor and attack the battleships is certainly an interesting one. I can see the appeal of the idea, especially if you believe either argument in its favor. After all, it's definitely true that one sub made it inside, the one rammed by USS Monaghan. The other submarine, number 16, is more of an open question. I hesitate to outright call it a myth, simply because we don't know exactly what happened to that boat. It's a subject of argument, to say the least, as we'll see tomorrow when I go over that wreck. Keep an eye out for that video. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one. And once more, I apologize for my stuffy voice.